Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? On behalf of Observer Research Foundation, let me warmly welcome you to this evening for a launch of a book by a young voice on South Asian strategic affairs. Let me welcome the author, Dr. Aparna Pande, and our three discussants, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, Dr. Sriram Cholia, and Dr. Constantinos Xavier. Well, as I said, this is a book by a very fresh voice, and therefore it's most welcome. Aparna, at the moment, is based at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., directing the initiative on the future of India and South Asia. So far, she had written and edited 2 books on Pakistan. So this is a first book where she's venturing in the territory of Indian foreign policy, and she's traversing a great deal in the book. The title says it all, From Chanakya to Modi. You cannot get more ambitious than that. So I think, congratulations, Aparna, for this book, and it is always wonderful to see fresh voices engaging in the discourse, in the strategic discourse in India on foreign policy issues. A discourse that unfortunately often tends to be dominated by certain few voices in Delhi. So it's always heartening to see new voices coming and challenging some of the older assumptions, and also allowing us to look at new ways to examine Indian foreign policy. And we at ORF are proud to be a part of this evening. We have a long-standing association with the Hudson Institute. We have done a lot of events with them in the past, and we hope we will continue to engage with Hudson in the future as well. We also, as I said, we have an excellent set of panelists, discussants who will engage with the book's key themes in a few minutes for now. But let me first invite Mr. Anthony Thomas, Commissioning Editor, Harper Collings India, for his remarks, and then from a formal launch of the book. Mr. Thomas.
Good evening. I'm happy to welcome all of you on behalf of Harper Collins to the launch of this wonderfully well-written book by Dr. Pande. Foreign policy of a country, it is often said, is based on enlightened self-interest. But Dr. Pande has gone ahead more than that and said it has to be informed by the civilizational heritage. And she has done an excellent job of tracing Chanakyan and Nehruvian roots of India's foreign policy. And I hope all of you will be buying this, because this gives us an overview of India's foreign policy. Before handing over the proceedings to Professor Pant, I would like to express my and HarperCollins thanks for Observer Foundation for associating with this launch and book discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you to all the discussants. And as I said, we have an excellent set of speakers with us today who will engage with some of the key themes that have been raised in the book by Aparna, and will perhaps delve a bit deeper into some of their agreements or disagreements to make the evening more interesting, perhaps. But before that, it's a very interesting time in Indian foreign policy, because there is a vibrant debate going on about the future trajectory of Indian foreign policy. And there is a clear divide at this point that we are witnessing. Those who are claiming that nothing is changing, that it's primarily more of the same, that Mr. Modi, despite his high decibel diplomacy, has not been able to shift the undercurrents of Indian foreign policy. Whereas there are others who are arguing that a fundamental transformation is indeed happening. And it's only 3 years down the line, we will perhaps see the emergence of a new foreign policy and a larger coherent argument around that foreign policy, perhaps over a period of time. So this is an interesting time, a point of inflection, perhaps, in Indian foreign policy literature, which is also being reflected in a number of works that have come out recently, just on the Modi doctrine, Modi foreign policy. Perhaps they are selling very well. So I think that's the reason why we are seeing a lot of literature. But I think there is a genuine debate also undergoing amongst the scholars and as well as practitioners of Indian foreign policy at this point. So therefore, as I said earlier, it's very heartening to see new voices coming into this discourse. And Aparna's voice is a very fresh one. She has engaged with some of our evolutionary trends, if you will, in the literature, and engaged with them in a manner that is very readable. So I think with that, I'll give the floor to Aparna herself for her initial comments, and then we will reach out to the three discussants for their points of views. Aparna.
This is great. Good evening. I would like to start by thanking Harper Collins India, especially Anant, Udayan, Shantanu, Anthony, and Aman. Also, deep gratitude to Observer Research Foundation. Thank you, Harsh, and Shubh, wherever he is. And it's great to be on a panel with Dr. Chaulia, Ambassador Mukherjee, and a very old and dear friend, Constantino. Every country's foreign policy has an underlying paradigm that explains what has influenced its policy and why that country takes the stand that it does. This paradigm is the product of the nation's history and its view of self. Leaders, especially those in premier positions for long periods, also shape how a nation sees itself in relation to others. The election of Mr. Modi represented a major shift in India's politics. In my book, I attempt to examine how Mr. Modi might set the direction of India's foreign policy at a time when its economy is expanding and its aspirations for a leading role in the world are growing. I argue that with some variation, India's external relations have shown remarkable continuity and consistency since independence in 1947, notwithstanding changes in leaders and ruling political parties. India is not alone in such constancy. Most countries base their foreign policy on a template shaped by their collective national experience. What Mr. Modi might pursue as India's interest has, in some ways, its roots in what Chanakya envisaged as the goal of a Chakravartin 2.5 millennia earlier. Indians take pride in the fact that India is a 5,000-year-old civilization, even if its modern incarnation as a democratic state is only 70 years old. Modern India's founding fathers, Jawaharlal Nehru being the most significant, sought to craft policies that would incorporate both India's historical legacy as well as its future geopolitical ambitions. My book is an attempt to explain India's foreign policy to the world. What are the ideas that influenced India's foreign policy, the individuals who left their mark, and the institutions that play a role in shaping India's worldview? The worldview of any nation is not and cannot be monochromatic. Examining India's foreign policy unveils what I identify in my book as the 4 key strands in India's worldview: messianic idealism, imperialist legacy, realism, and isolationism. Messianic idealism reflects the mantra of global peace, justice, and prosperity, and has served as a strong moral component of India's foreign policy, inspired by a moral legacy of ancient Indian thought and reiterated during the national struggle under Mahatma Gandhi. This element of Indian exceptionalism often forms part of India's view of itself and of the world. Every Indian leader, whether Mahatma Gandhi or Swami Vivekanand, whether Mr. Nehru or Mr. Modi, has demanded that the rest of the world accord India a stature commensurate to its civilizational contribution. At the same time, Indians have had no qualms in anchoring external relations in realism. The Indian state has a Hobbesian view of the world, where India can only depend on itself. This explains the strong desire for strategic autonomy, the push for economic autarky, and the pursuit of military self-sufficiency. The imperial school of thought, imperialist legacy, draws primarily from the most recent pre-independence experience of decision-making known to India, the period of the Raj. For this outlook, India is the center and Delhi knows best. While desirous of playing a global role, India has also been reluctant to be drawn into global issues or ideologies. There's a strong streak of isolationism in India's global outlook. One of the many paradoxes is that India wants to be seen as a great power, but is often still reluctant to do what is required of most great powers. Until the advent of the Raj, with the exception of the ancient South Indian Chola dynasty, no other Indian empire had sought to extend itself beyond the Indian subcontinent. India's foreign policy paradigm thus draws from its civilizational heritage as much as from modern ideas about national interest. The Indian sense of self and of the world, as well as the architecture of Indian institutions, has been profoundly affected by the colonial and post-independence era. Indian exceptionalism has its roots in history. 5,000 years of continuous history and civilization have left their mark. The deep-rooted inheritance of India's long civilizational past is the belief that India's civilizational greatness trumps the current status of the Indian state. Under the influence of founding fathers, the average Indian has always believed that India was special, is special, and always remains special. The influence of ancient India's most famous political philosopher, Chanakya, lies in the way in which India has sought a system of layered relations, coupled with a mistrust of other nations, the core of the Mandala theory. Chanakya explains why, despite close relations with Western countries, India still maintains ties with Russia, old friends in the developing world from the non-aligned movement, and is an active participant in groupings like BRICS. Ancient philosophers taught that the subcontinent was one civilizational and geographical entity. India's outlook on its immediate neighbors is heavily influenced by the Indian view that these countries are an integral part of Indian civilization. In addition to the ancient Hindu philosophers and kings, medieval Muslim sultans added religious and cultural pluralism to Indian life. Another heritage from the medieval era was the intense personalization of administration. Although ancient Indian strategists and Indian empires were aware of the world around them, it was the British Raj under which India found itself connected strategically to a neighborhood beyond the subcontinent. In the realm of institutions, the legacy of the Raj is paramount. India is a strong federation with a Westminster-style parliamentary form of government, where the permanent bureaucracy plays a dominant role in both the making and execution of policy. The colonial experience left an indelible mark on India's collective personality. More than 7 decades after independence, seeking freedom from external pressures is as much at the core of India's external policy as it was when India was a colony. The pursuit of an independent path has always been tied to a moral certitude that India ought to be a beacon, not only for Asia, but for the entire world. To create this idealized world, India has championed non-alignment, encouraged multilateral cooperation to the United Nations and other organizations, supported decolonization and disarmament. Modern India expects its neighbors to consider India the Chakravartin, and South Asia is the only region where India has been willing to send its army or use force to defend its interests. Growing Chinese presence have made Indian leaders aware that managing a sphere of influence is not only a function of telling others what to do, but being able to expend resources that deny space to competitors. India's economic expansion has enabled India to employ economic tools in managing national security and maintaining international influence. For years, India's leaders and government did not accord economic foreign policy the same priority as security policy. In the international arena, India saw the world's major powers, especially the industrialized nations, as unwilling to cater to the interests of previously colonized countries. A global order that allows international organizations to simply echo the desires of Western powers would be too reminiscent of the colonial era. In 1947, there were 3.5 million persons of Indian origin in the British Dominion and colonies. As of 2015, there are 27 million. India receives about $70 billion a year in remittances. and India's diaspora extends from Africa and the Americas to Fiji and Australia. It's considered an asset today. However, this is only in recent years that the Indian government has strengthened ties with this diaspora. My book examines and details the individuals and the workings of the various institutions that shaped India's foreign policy. I describe the key pillars of Nehruianism, the style and substance shifts, and I look at the various prime ministers and their influence. India's parliament, however, has played a lesser role in formulation and execution of foreign policy than other parliamentary democracies. The professionally trained civil service that is described as the steel frame of government in India has had far more influence in the conduct of foreign policy. Beginning with history, I end with analyzing the new nationalist internationalism espoused by Prime Minister Modi and what it might mean for India. Mr. Modi resembles the first Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru, in his zealous focus on foreign policy. His doctrine, though still evolving, appears to have elements of both continuity and change with his predecessors. The Modi worldview is underpinned by the intrinsic link between economic growth and projection of power abroad. Mr. Modi conducts foreign policy with the help of a small group of advisors he trusts. He prefers to deal directly with his officers, a practice similar to Mr. Nehru. He has also built a direct relationship with the Indian public using traditional media, Man Ki Baat, but also Twitter. Modern India is cognizant of President Roosevelt's maxim, speaking softly while carrying a big stick. Yet her leaders have often demonstrated a preference to high words instead of quiet actions. India's economy has tremendous potential. There's a huge demographic dividend, which is waiting to be harnessed. And Mr. Modi's administration has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build on this. However, India's history is both its asset as well as its burden. The fact that the country has existed for millennia creates a hubris and a belief that in the final analysis, India will go on. Why bother with building a new framework for global engagement when the legacy is massive enough to enable muddling through? India's success as a 21st century world leader depends on jettisoning that way of thinking and embracing the vision of an India that acts like a great power, not just talks like one. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna, for a very succinct account of your main arguments. And can I now invite Dr. Sriram Chaulia?
Thank you, Harsh. Good evening, everyone. As a professor, I cannot resist the lectern, so please pardon me. And this is not a precedent. The rest of them can continue to sit and remark if they wish. I'm so thrilled to be on this panel, launching Aparna's book, because, as Harsh said, we need more voices to contribute to the discourse on what's happening and what is the etymology and the origin of many of the practices and the institutions of the way India has dealt with the world. And I think Aparna has done a phenomenal job, and I would classify it as a work of history, contemporary history largely, but also tying the threads all the way back to Buddhist thought, to Chanakya, of course, and trying to show how lineage is carried forward over centuries in this unbroken civilization of ours. So I think that's an important contribution, because there are some deeper insights. She has obviously put a lot of thought into it while making these assertions. For example, there's quite a bit in this book about the role of prime ministers and their personalities in shaping foreign policy of independent India. And she traces it back to, imperial dynasties, as well as the British Raj, and similarly, the centrality of the bureaucracy and the way they have managed India's foreign policy in the last 70 years. She traces it backwards. It's like a loop, going back to state structures and state formation all the way to the Mauryan dynasty and then back and forth. So it's like a very interesting conception of how some of the key trends and practices which we tend to take for granted as given actually have been constructed over a long millennia old process. So it's a kind of process tracing, if you like, that she's done. And I want to highlight some very important contributions. There's one, she already mentioned the typology of the different traditions or schools of Indian foreign policy. And frankly, we've lacked these things. There's a lot of empirical work in India about specific policies and our approach to a country or to a region. But withdrawing as a scholar from the empirical density of facts, what she's tried to do is discern some important schools of thought. So these four she mentioned, messianic idealism, realism, imperialism, and isolationism, seem to capture most of the differences that have existed within the foreign policy firmament. So I think it's always important as a scholarly work to make a contribution to classification and to create new labels and to give us new handles with which we can describe something. So Gujral is this, Indira Gandhi was this, Modi is this. It helps. So I strongly recommend that you read and think about it. There are also a number of very interesting observations she has throughout this relatively short work on our approach to different regions of the world, and even those she traces them back. So for example, I think we have now outgrown it, but for a long time we've been boxed in as a subcontinental power, right? And Aparna talks about why that is so, and how it is often seen as our natural zone, and how it's only the British, she says, who came in and started making us think about statecraft and beyond the subcontinent and linking us to the Middle East and to Southeast Asia. And that is how, she says, the post-colonial state inherited some of these notions of what is our strategic space and took it forward. But going backwards, she talks about how it was taken as a given that princes and kingdoms and monarchs of medieval and ancient times never thought of extending beyond the subcontinent, at least not militarily, although we had trade with different regions of the world. And she discusses the Chola exception. It's quite interesting as to what drove them to attack what is today modern Indonesia, or the Srivijaya kingdom. So there's a lot of diplomatic history, and I think it's a fine effort as far as that goes. There are a few issues that I'd like to raise for Aparna's consideration. One of which is I wish you were a little more opinionated in the work. As a work of history, obviously she's interpreting a lot, but I would have liked to see, a more sharper and critical line on various policies that we've had in the past as well as the present ones. I think there is. I wanted to quote from some pages, but I'll leave them for the audience to think about. Strategic autonomy, for example, which has often been spoken as one of the central pillars of foreign policy thought in this country. Again, it's linked to colonial legacy and how it's been brought forward. These are all very interesting, I think, observations. You may agree or disagree. Then exceptionalism. This is something which is central. She just mentioned the notion that we are special and that we have some manifest destiny. And there she has done a very interesting comparison with the US, the shining city on a hill parable and all those things, and how this often drives. Sometimes we think we are on the right, and sometimes we think we are doing what is morally correct as well as in our strategic interest, but the rest of the world is puzzled because they don't share our own self esteem which we ourselves have built about ourselves as a great nation that's doing the noblest things possible, right? So she talks about this again. I think is very fascinating. So instead of running through policies vis-a-vis different regions or in different eras, what she has done is highlight some of the central tenets of our foreign policy and how these are linked to an unbroken thread going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. One of the chapters about institutions is very important because we continue to demand and want some changes in the way the institutional frame of the state has evolved. She's spoken about how it is broadened and how we are now getting more inputs from outside the career bureaucracy. But the point she raised about parliament is interesting because that's where I think our committees, standing committee, consultative committees, have a lot to learn from the US model, where they are far more interventionist than, and people's representatives have a greater say. I don't have to mention the latest US sanctions on Russia. Even though the executive doesn't want it, it's the legislature that's pushing it in the US system, for good or for bad. But the point is, they grill the executive for various acts of omission and commission. I don't think our bureaucrats and our ministers face the same scrutiny on foreign affairs from our people's representatives. That's something worth. So to sum up, I think Aparna, what she's saying is basically that, there's continuity and change, but for us to achieve the next level, we will have to change a lot more. And I think that's the basic point. And she's got a very nice conclusion where she's saying that we can't just sit back and say we are great and the world has to accept us. What she's saying is we need concerted action and energy from the highest levels of government, as well as from broader set of stakeholders. I would have liked to see a little more on the role of business and the business community in shaping foreign policy, especially in the era of globalization of the last 20-25 years. And how much, she has mentioned the chambers and how they're getting in on foreign economic policy, but given our Prime Minister's emphasis that even the career diplomats must be trained in trade negotiations and in investment negotiations and in these kind of technical minutiae, moving away from the generalist training of the previous decades. I think there's a lot that needs to change in the stakeholders and in the ones who are shaping our foreign policy. And this is a very timely contribution. And I would have liked to see more on the role of other players, non-state actors, in shaping what India is doing. I think one aspect which she may have missed while she was thinking about it is one of the reasons we tend to be still relatively parochial in our outlook and largely concerned about our own neighbors, and of course domestically preoccupied, is the nature of the economic growth that's happened in the last 30 years. Which is driven by domestic consumption. So trade is playing a larger role in our GDP, but it still isn't the same, doesn't count for as much as, say, for China or for Japan. So I think this work, I think, should be read by all, especially young people who are wanting to make have a say on the way this nation is run and the way it interacts with the rest of the world, and also to see to test out some of their assumptions, because we think we are often critical of many things that are currently happening and are not happening. But what Aparna is saying is there's a context to this, and we must always draw backwards and appreciate it. But that's not to justify what's happening. I think her work is actually an interventionist work, because ultimately what she's saying is we need to do much more. So, for example, usage of military force beyond our immediate neighborhood. I think we are increasingly going to be forced to do that to protect our increasing economic interests, as well as to play this role that we often envisage of being a net provider of security in different regions of the world. So there are some very interesting ideas, progressive thoughts, as well as a lot of reflection about how the past is still imbuing the present. So congratulations, Aparna, and please read it. Thank you.
I'm used to the lectern for some other reasons, but not being a professor. But the last 3 years, I suppose I got used to a lectern. Anyway, I want to first thank Aparna for having written this book. For me, as someone who has been a practitioner of diplomacy and foreign policy for more than 3.5 decades, the book is really a very important construct to explain to me what I was doing for these last 37 years. And I think, as Dr. Sriram Chawla has mentioned, the reason for that is because this book, instead of going into different regions of the world and talking of India's policy towards those regions, has tried to contribute the new typology, as he called it, the 4 schools, messianic, imperial, realist, and isolationist. So it's an interesting way to look at the world. And in the structure of her book, I think, which has also been done very consciously, she has devoted 2 chapters to the broad outlines of India's foreign policy, and seeing these against the background of the 4 schools that she's talked about. For me, the most interesting were the chapters on the individual personalities who have contributed to the formulation of Indian foreign policy. And linked with that, something that is for some of us very, very much part of our lives, the attempts for the last 2 decades or more to introduce a culture of national security, or a strategic culture, into India's formulation of policy. This is still probably work in progress because of different domestic reasons, but there is no denying the fact, which she has emphasized, that without a national strategic culture, it will be difficult for India to sustain its aspirations to be a great power. And the book's title for me was quite interesting. It's a very, very broad sweep. But then when I was reading it, I understood that what she actually was doing was applying the perspectives of Chanakya to the application of foreign policy of India, especially after 1947. So it is, in that sense, something that is contemporary, and at the same time looks at issues which are contemporary with a perspective of more than 2 millennia. It is not surprising for those of us who've had to implement India's foreign policy to find the large role played by Jawaharlal Nehru. And in the book too, there's a huge amount of work that has gone in on explaining Nehru's contribution to the conceptualization, the formulation, as well as the implementation of foreign policy. One of the reasons why he used to probably reply to telegrams addressed to him by Indian envoys abroad was that he was not only Prime Minister but also his own Foreign Minister. So he decided to sort of wear both hats and respond to issues which you mentioned in your book. It's not surprising for me, given this approach, to find, and I would like to hear if I'm wrong in that impression, that in terms of the application of Chanakya's principles and perspectives, the 2 prime ministers who actually stand out, although Aparna has said that Nehru himself also used the pseudonym of Chanakya when he wrote, but the 2 prime ministers who actually stand out are Indira Gandhi and probably Narendra Modi. These are the 2 who she looks at in terms of the way in which Chanakya's precepts are applied in the area of foreign policy. Now, Dr. Chawla has given many reasons why we should read the book, and I endorse all of them. So I will not go into that side, but I think what I would like to do is to deal with 4 issues which, in a sense, come out of the book. And I think these are questions which probably practitioners and thinkers of Indian foreign policy need to look at today. The first is the treatment of the Jammu and Kashmir issue in India's foreign policy. Now, for me, for many years, and especially in the last 5 years, it has been an enigma as to why, when the issue of Jammu and Kashmir was overtaking independent India within the first few months of our independence, we followed a policy which actually even today to me does not make sense. And that is that on the one hand, we were engaged in the months of October and November. The invasion of Jammu and Kashmir took place on 22nd October 1947. So we were engaged in fighting an election for a non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council. And that was deadlocked. The other country which wanted that seat was Ukraine. And it went through several rounds of voting, but neither country could get the 2/3 majority needed to get that seat. And then in the middle of November, India stands up in the General Assembly of the United Nations and says that it concedes the seat, concedes the election, and lets Ukraine sit in the Security Council. Now the question is that middle of November, Pakistan has already invaded our territory. And probably people at that time are formulating the complaint that we would take to the Security Council on the 1st of January 1948. But the consequence of what happened in that period meant that when the issue was tabled by India, the decisions that were to be taken on the issue, India was missing from the room. And that is something that I think is very, very relevant even today for addressing this refrain which at least this Prime Minister has been making consistently, Mr. Modi, for the last 3 years, which is that India must become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Many people think, especially outsiders, that it's linked with some status. But it's actually not so much the status of being a permanent member, but the actual hardcore national interest of issues which continue to be on the agenda of the Security Council, like Jammu and Kashmir. It's been there since 1st of January 1948, and it will never go away until the two sides or all the sides agree to remove it from the agenda. So I think that that's one issue which I think we need to look at. The other issue is on the bilateral side. And again, something that recent historical research and scholarship has thrown up as an issue which practitioners and thinkers of foreign policy must ask about and think about, and that is our relations with China. It is very odd for someone who reads this mass of literature that has come out in the past 5-7 years, when you realize that actually during the period just before our independence and just after our independence, there were very close relations between India and China, especially in the military field. One scholar has recorded how 10,000 Chinese soldiers were garrisoned in Ramgarh in Bihar to be trained by the United States in the common fight against the Japanese invasion at that time. Now, the question which comes out of the book is, why did Nehru change horses as far as China was concerned? And in 1950, why was India the only country? We had got into the Security Council in 1950. We were one of the 3 countries which voted in favor of admitting China into the United Nations. Now, why did this happen is still a question which we don't know. But as we deal with China today, I think it's worth thinking about this question, especially in terms of the future relationship between India and China. Because if nothing else, nothing remains constant, and some of us who've dealt with, for example, the previous monolithic communist system, the Soviet Union, have seen how the Soviet Union has transitioned away from communism into something else. So it's possible that even the China we see today could transition into something else, and can we influence that transition? That's the kind of thinking that may interest people like Aparna. The third is a non-political thing, but it's something that's linked with, again, the focus that is there for the current government, which was encapsulated by the slogan of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, or development. And it's something that, very often when we hear India speak of in international forums, and especially during negotiations, this feeling of what Dr. Chaulia and Aparna herself in a book has called the Indian destiny, manifest destiny, that is sometimes inescapable when you listen to the way India negotiates on issues like development. But I think that a book of this kind, which has come, actually serves a very useful purpose, because it takes you to the way in which, starting from probably a messianic zeal position, we have reached from between 1972 to 2015 to a combination of realism and networking. And this is illustrated best by the way in which the entire focus on eradication of poverty has been dealt with by Indian diplomacy. 1972, Indira Gandhi, the only head of state to participate in the first International Environmental Conference in Stockholm, said poverty is the greatest polluter. She was pilloried for saying that she was being populist and she had no regard for the environment. That was what the reaction the international community made at that time. Fast forward to 2015, the first goal of the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, Agenda 2030, is eradication of poverty. So, I mean, in a sense, does it justify the Indian feeling of manifest destiny or does it not? This is something that I think is interesting to look at. And the fourth is something that Aparna deals with again quite extensively in a book, which is non-alignment and India's network of friends and this kind of creating a big international constituency. It's something that was very much part of Indian foreign policy for many years until the non-aligned movement itself started to atrophy for reasons of which are not linked with India, but linked with the kind of leadership that it went into. You had successive presidents like Egypt, Iran, and now Venezuela. So there are problems facing the movement. But the point being made in the book, and I think the point which is valid for Indian foreign policy in terms of implementation, is the importance of the network. And while we may not call it the non-aligned network, but there is still a broadly termed developing country network, of which I would argue India is one of the natural leaders. Our competition is there with China and with some other countries, but given the kinds of dimensions which Dr. Chaulia mentioned of our economic, trade, other growth, it is necessary for us to not forego that role which has been discussed quite extensively in the book. There are two reasons for that. One is a reference which she made in her introduction to something that I had a bit of a role in, which was the Yoga Day. And the Yoga Day actually is a good illustration of the importance of the network. How did 177 countries join Mr. Modi's proposal? This is a case study by itself. But another reason, and you will see it as we go into foreign policy and foreign trade policy in the next few months, is linked with our entire approach to multilateralism. There's a very, very interesting speech by our current Commerce and Industry Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, made in Geneva a few days ago, on India and multilateralism. And I think that the important thing that I'd like to mention before I conclude is that we have in many ways participated as India in creating the institutions of global governance. We were not, like Pakistan, late entries into these institutions. We didn't have to seek entry. We were there from the foundation of these instruments, of these institutions, whether they were the League of Nations in 1919, the United Nations in 1945, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, GATT. Every one of these institutions, India is a founding member. And I think that gives us the necessary perspective with which to now move to mold these multilateral institutions to the kind of perspective, in global perspective, that we are beginning to articulate more and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for a very insightful account, practitioner's account of and insights into Aparna's work, and hopefully for many of us who study Indian foreign policy, a few pointers as to where our research should take us. So thank you for that. With that, may I invite Dr. Constantino Xavier for his remarks. He's a fellow at Carnegie India at the moment.
Thank you, Harsh. I was hesitating whether I should go to the lectern or not, but then I saw that actually JNU is in the majority here. And like the three of us went to JNU, so it's an act of rebellion. I will stay here in a good JNU tradition and speak in a very simple way, in a very democratic way here. So Aparna, congratulations, it's an excellent book. Thank you to ORF for hosting this discussion.
People think that we are elitist. So
No.
don't say
We are, JNU is very elitist. So I think, thank you very much to ORF for hosting this, and to Harper Collins also for incentivizing, I think, young scholarship and new scholarship on Indian foreign policy. I'll restrict my comments to two sections, Aparna. I think it's, first of all, it's an excellent book. I think it's difficult to put into 5 chapters such an elegant, clear, concise overview of Indian foreign policy. the individuals, the interests, the history, the institutions behind Indian foreign policy. I think it's really a manual, a perfect handbook also for students, particularly abroad, I would say also, but even in India, I think we have also a lot of people here who are not exposed so much to Indian foreign policy as we are, and it's a very good introduction into that Indian foreign policy experience. But I'll just highlight 4 points, which I found particularly interesting in the book, and then end with 2 sort of forward-thinking issues, which I think are important for us as a community who is doing scholarship on Indian foreign policy. I think beyond, all your objectives to look at the neural roots of external engagement, you're saying it's important to look at continuity and change. You're saying that India has this weird idea of exceptionalism, lacks the wherewithal, the military capacity and institutional structure to act as a major world power, so there's tremendous deficiencies there. But in terms of concrete actual issues, I think there's a first one, which I found very interesting, is that you look at Nehru in a very pragmatic and balanced way. Especially in these days here in Delhi, I think that's an achievement. I think, in many ways, Nehruvians have been Nehru's worst enemies because they've glorified him. They've looked at Nehru as this idealist, moralist, put him up on a pedestal, and now you have people throwing down that pedestal. Even though he was never wanting to be on the pedestal, I think he was a great statesman, but he was a very pragmatic statesman. I think in your various sections on Nehru, you avoid the typical narrative which is prevalent in popular culture, but also in scholarship, that Nehru was an idealist. Then slowly India normalized and became more realist, more pragmatic, and finally in the 1990s, India sort of flourished as a normal state, nuclearized, developed its military, and is slowly now becoming a real, normal, hard state, instead of this dreamy, lofty, idealist state. And you've completely dismissed that, and you have a very balanced take on Nehru. I think that should be appreciated, and it's very important to take a more moderate view of the legacy of a great statesman who's really walked that fine balance between values and interests, which I think you mentioned several times. The second issue is an issue which is very dear to my researchers, the neighborhood. And you several times bring up the neighborhood. You mentioned India has something akin to the American Monroe Doctrine. But at the same time, and I think this is very important for these days, you mentioned, let me just quote you from the sentence, you say, managing a sphere of regional influence. So India managing its South Asian region of influence is not only telling others what to do, but being able to expend resources that deny space to competitors. And I find it extremely relevant as we speak in terms of what India is trying to achieve, which is basically a transition from what you mentioned, the old way of telling others what to do, which is what Natvar Singh in the 1980s famously coined as the right of first refusal. Basically, if Nepal or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh needs something, you come to Delhi and you request Delhi for something, and Delhi will ponder, think, wait, lose the file, and eventually not deliver. And then what does the king of Nepal do, or what does Jayavardhan do? He goes to the US or to China, very obviously, and barely hides the equipment coming from China. So just, of course, India gets a notice of it, and Delhi goes into alarm mode and finally delivers and wakes up, right? So this has been the traditional mode, I think, of denial often in the region. And from that, I think the big shift, and this is, I think, something you allude to, is one of capacity of first delivery. So the capacity of actually being a first responder and connect with your neighbors to deliver the resources they require and they need. Because in a world which is interdependent, in which you have an alternative called China, your neighbors will have those alternatives and will explore them, and you better be there first and give them what they need, better, more, and first, rather than wait and see and be sort of sidelined by your competitors. The third issue I found very interesting is, and it's a bit of a critical issue, because you allude to the perils of centralization of decision making. And you saw a little on the Facebook, the little discussion we had this morning about comparing Nehru and Modi. And I think for a lot of people these days here in Delhi, the idea is to distinguish Modi from Nehru, elevate Patel as sort of a nemesis or antithesis to Nehru. But actually, you make a very interesting comparison between these two people as great statesmen who focused on two particular things. One is reaching out domestically to explain to the domestic public in India why external engagements are important, right? So Prime Minister Modi has done an excellent job at that. He's reached out to new audiences domestically and done what Nehru used to do, which is literally speak to farmers about foreign policy and explain why India's external engagement is important. And in particular, these days, I think, and this is something which we'll see if Prime Minister Modi is capable of doing, is explaining to the most dispossessed domestic audiences, including those who have most to lose from India's economic opening, that reforms are in India's interest. And economic opening is in India's long-term interests and in India's long-term security interests. The second issue is that this broadly international engagement, right? That you have both prime ministers, both Nehru and Modi is probably the most traveled prime ministers who've emphasized personal institutional engagement worldwide and have individually, personally committed to this themselves to this outreach and to India's international image. So that comparison I think is very valid. You make many other comparisons between Prime Ministers Nehru and Modi, and I think that's also worth exploring. At the same time, though, there's a danger of excessive centralization, which you speak to. And you speak that, the charismatic leadership, strong leaders often, are tremendously efficient in the short term. They centralize policy, they're efficient in implementing policy. But at the same time, that comes with the long-term price of sidelining the bureaucracy, taking autonomy away from bureaucratic and administrative structures, sidelining, in this case, the Ministry of External Affairs. So that balance, I think, is both for Nehru and Prime Minister Modi, you see, is a similar critical issue, and I think that you bring it up several times in your book, which is very interesting. And the last thing is, you mentioned this issue of lack of institutionalization. And actually today, we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of a seminal essay by George Tanham, an American scholar, bureaucrat, government official for the Rand Corporation, who came to India in 1992, spent literally a month and a half in Delhi and wrote, initially 30, 40 pages, decrying that India has no capacity to think strategically, that India has some deficiency in terms of implementing foreign policy, being rational, and just strangely, this white man's essay, because that's what it was, became very popular in India and actually still informs a lot of Indian thinking, which is extremely disturbing because, if you have a foreigner coming to India and telling in a very, I have to say, neo-colonial way that there's something tremendously wrong with India and India is not able to think strategically, deal with force, coercion, and the hard instruments of power. And I think it's therefore very timely that you come up with a book which allows us to find lines of continuity, of strategic continuity in Indian decision-making, which go beyond individuals, which go beyond party politics and ideology, and which really are reasons of state. And I think all your case studies, all your issues in the book show very clearly there's tremendous lines of continuity. There's a tremendous strategic culture, Indian strategic culture, of thinking about various issues in a very rational way and implementing those. And actually, I was also reminded to the day, I think in 1987 here at this exact place, IIC, you had P.N. Huxar giving a very interesting lecture saying, don't confuse the slogans and the causes, the slogans and the flags with people march in the streets with the actual causes that drive the practice of politics. And he mentioned this here in 87 in India because he was exactly responding to the big speeches, of non-alignment, values, exceptionalism, supposedly driving Indian speech, but in practice, if you look very closely, India has a very different tradition of doing things in a very different way from what it speaks. So coming to the end, in terms of the 2-3 critical issues I wanted to address is, the book is a broad overview. You're clear about that, and you make that, you don't go deep into case studies. But at the same time, I think this is really an invitation for younger scholars like us to follow up on your grid of analysis and test your lines of continuity in practice. How does India actually, behave? How does India actually practice foreign policy? And this leads me to a fundamental issue, which I think is the problem of our scholarship on India. You have a tremendous tradition in terms of speech, Indian foreign policy speech. You read the selected works of Nehru and you have fabulous speeches about non-interference. But the moment I stepped into the National Archives of India in January 2014, and I remember the first cable of Prime Minister Nehru with instructions to his ambassador in Kathmandu about what India's foreign policy should be towards Nepal in the mid-50s, that there's no other definition than interference. And it was a pure logic of interference, involvement, intervention, managing Nepal with the best of intentions, democratizing Nepal, supporting Nepal in order to stop Chinese security threats. But you have that tradition, and I remember it was a shock to me because I opened that first file and I couldn't believe I was reading the same man I had been reading from a very different angle. And this leads me to the point of the importance of declassification. It's easier today for foreign scholars, European or American scholars, to do archival research in the Republic of China than in India. And this is tremendously paradoxically, right? You have a democratic, open society like India, where the archives remain largely closed in a very poor state of conditions. And only now, and to the credit of this government, finally you have been declassifying a first batch of 70,000 to 80,000 files from the 50s and 60s. But crucial issues remain close to public scrutiny. Now, if scholars and the public audience are not able to test speech with practice, with what actually was happening in government, and benefit from the experience I had on Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Burma, which was my research, in which I saw the divergence between speech and practice, and a very strong strategic practice, a very strong national interest of India, and Indian government officials very clear about what their security interests were in the region. Very different from the speeches of non-interference, and we don't care about the region, we will not do anything in Nepal or Sri Lanka. If that doesn't happen, it'll be very difficult for us to have, I think, a very clear idea about Indian strategic practice. And I have to say, this is my conclusion from what I saw in the region, India's exceptional strategic acumen and skill in dealing with foreign policy issues, particularly in the region, but also in other issues. So I think your book is a real invitation to do that, and I hope many of us will follow and try to replicate what you did with greater empirical depth. Thank you.